The dawn came like a secret. Soft light spilled across the prairie, gilding each blade of grass with gold, and a hush lay over the land so deep it felt almost holy. The earth still breathed the scent of last night's rain, wet soil, new blossoms, the faint sweetness of wild sage. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk's cry cut through the morning, sharp and lonely, as if announcing the birth of another quiet day no one would remember. Yet something in that morning stirred differently, as if the world itself were holding its breath for what was about to begin. Jackie Sutherland rode through that silence, a tall man on a bay horse, his shoulders broad beneath the worn leather of his vest. His hat cast a shadow across his eyes, but not enough to hide the tired calm that lived there. He'd seen too many winters, buried too many dreams, and now he moved through his days like a man carved from the land itself, steady, wordless, enduring. His ranch lay just beyond the cottonwoods, a scatter of weathered timbers tucked against the wide horizon where the grass rolled like waves under the wind. To anyone else, it was nothing more than another lonely homestead in the middle of nowhere. To Jackie, it was all that was left. As he reached the crest of a hill, the first thin line of smoke rose from his chimney. The sight was ordinary, but something inside him eased. It meant warmth. It meant life. It meant she was awake. Jing Lan. She had come to him months ago, a stranger with eyes that carried both the ocean and a history of sorrow. She'd arrived quiet, asking only for work and a roof. Jackie hadn't asked where she came from or what she ran from. He wasn't a man who pried. But over time, her presence filled the house like morning sunlight, gentle, necessary, healing. The smell of her cooking greeted him now as he dismounted, the faint fragrance of herbs and freshly baked bread threading through the damp air. He stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and the warmth from the hearth wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. Jing stood by the table, sleeves rolled up, her hands deep in dough. Her movements were graceful, efficient. Each press and fold of her palms carried quiet strength. A lock of black hair had slipped loose, brushing her cheek as she worked. She looked up only when she felt him near, and for a fleeting heartbeat their eyes met. It was always like that. Silent glances, small pauses that said more than words ever could. "Morning," he murmured, his voice low, roughened by sleep and wind. She nodded, offering the faintest smile before lowering her gaze again. The bread would be ready soon, and she wanted it perfect. She always did. Jackie washed his hands at the basin, his mind already on the fences needing mending, the calves that had broken through the north pasture again. Yet even as he dried his hands, his attention lingered on her face, the way the firelight painted it soft, the way her eyes, dark and deep, carried a quiet he couldn't name. And then he saw it, barely there at first, a shadow along her cheekbone, like the smudge of a memory. But when she turned slightly, the light caught it full. A bruise, faint, yellowing at the edges, but unmistakable. Something inside him went still. He didn't speak. Jackie was not a man who reacted quickly. He sat at the edge of the table, watching the dough rise, letting the silence stretch between them like a test. Jing's hands didn't stop moving, but the air in the room changed. The rhythm faltered. The quiet thickened. She felt his gaze on her and knew he had seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, and heavy with restrained emotion. "Who did it?" The question fell into the room like a stone into water, rippling through the quiet. Her hands stilled. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a breath that trembled faintly, she whispered, "Some men at the market. They were drinking. They wanted me to smile." She swallowed, her voice thinning. "When I didn't, one of them pushed me. Another struck me. It's finished." Finished. The word broke against the silence like fragile glass. Jackie didn't move, but his jaw tightened. His eyes, steady and dark, burned with something cold and dangerous beneath the calm. She saw it, the way his hands curled slightly at his sides, the way his chest rose slower, deeper. He stood without a word. "Where are you going?" she asked, fear rising with her voice, though she already knew the answer. Jackie paused at the doorway, rain-slick light outlining the shape of his frame, the quiet power in his shoulders, the scar that curved along his forearm. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, with that unflinching steadiness that marked everything he did, he stepped out into the open, closing the door softly behind him. Jing stood frozen, the smell of bread and smoke thick around her, her flour-dusted hands trembling. She pressed them to her chest, as if to still her heartbeat. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and though she couldn't see him, she felt the weight of his silence in the distance, heavy as thunder before a storm. She did not sleep that night. Rain came again, soft at first, then hard enough to drum against the roof. The shutters rattled, and the lantern flickered with each gust. Jing sat by the window, staring into the dark where the outlines of horses shifted faintly in the barn. She whispered prayers in her own tongue, words she hadn't spoken since leaving her homeland. Words for safety. Words for peace. Outside, Jackie stood under the trees, his hat pulled low, the rain tracing paths down his face. He had not gone to town yet. Not yet. He stood there in silence, thinking of her words, thinking of the men who had laughed and struck and walked away. His hands ached for action, but his heart warred with something deeper, because anger was easy, but protection demanded more than rage. He thought of the first time he'd seen her, thin as a reed, eyes hollow, standing at his doorstep in the cold. How she'd worked without complaint, how her small laughter, rare as rain in drought, had started to fill the quiet places of his house. He thought of the way her presence had softened the edges of his loneliness, how he had begun to wait for the sound of her footsteps in the morning. Now, the bruise on her cheek burned in his mind like a mark against his own flesh. By dawn, the rain eased. Mist hung low over the prairie, ghostly and pale. Jing stepped outside, her shawl wrapped tight, the ground soft beneath her bare feet. Jackie was already at the stables, saddling his horse. His movements were slow, deliberate, the way a man prepares when he's made a decision that cannot be undone. "Please," she said, voice breaking, "don't go. They'll only make it worse." He didn't look up. The cinch tightened under his hand, the horse stamping once against the damp earth. He turned then, meeting her gaze across the grey light. In his eyes she saw something she couldn't name. Fury, sorrow, maybe love. The kind of love that hides beneath silence, deep and unwavering. "It's already worse," he said quietly. She wanted to run after him, to hold him back, but her feet wouldn't move. She could only watch as he swung into the saddle, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat, his silhouette swallowed slowly by the fog. He rode toward town, toward the men who had hurt her, and toward a choice that would change both their lives. The prairie watched, vast and unblinking. And somewhere in the stillness, Jing whispered a prayer, not for safety, not for herself, but for him. The story of their hearts had begun not with confession or touch, but with a bruise, a silence, and a man who refused to look away. Because sometimes love doesn't start with words, it starts with noticing. And out there, beneath the endless sky, two broken souls were about to find each other in the quietest, most powerful way. If this story has touched something in your heart, stay with it. Let the wind, the rain, and the tender ache of their journey remind you that kindness is never wasted, that love grows even in the hardest soil. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep walking beside these hearts, because sometimes healing begins not with grand gestures, but with the quiet act of listening to a story that feels a little like your own. The rain had washed the prairie clean, leaving behind a world reborn. Every blade of grass glistened under the tender morning light, each droplet trembling like a small truth waiting to be spoken. The horizon stretched endless and silver, and somewhere far off a lark sang, a fragile sound that seemed to reach even the most wounded corners of the earth. Jing stood by the window, shawl drawn around her shoulders, watching that light creep slowly over the land. It was beautiful, heartbreakingly so, and yet it brought her no peace. The house still smelled of the bread she had baked yesterday, but she could not eat. Her hands were restless, her heart heavy with fear. He had not come back. All night she had listened for the sound of hooves, for the familiar thud of his boots on the porch, but only the wind had answered. She had prayed, softly, desperately, in the language of her childhood, each word rising like smoke into the dark. Now, with morning finally breaking, she felt the ache of waiting settle deep in her bones. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove. She moved to pour the water, her hands trembling as she filled the old tin cup. Steam rose, curling against her face, carrying the faint scent of wild mint. The warmth comforted her for a moment, a small healing touch against the uncertainty that pressed around her like fog. Then, faintly, she heard it. The low, steady rhythm of hooves against the wet earth. Her breath caught. She turned toward the window. Through the haze of light and mist, a shape emerged. Broad shoulders, a dark horse, a man moving with the slow gravity of someone who had met something ugly and returned from it unchanged, or perhaps changed forever. Jackie. He dismounted without a word, his boots sinking into the damp soil. His hat was pulled low, his jaw shadowed, his shirt clinging with rain and sweat. Jing ran to the door before she could think. She froze at the threshold, one hand gripping the frame. Their eyes met. He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable, the silence between them dense as thunderclouds. Then, wordlessly, he took off his hat, hung it on the peg, and walked past her into the kitchen. She followed slowly. The room seemed to shrink around them. The smell of firewood mingled with rain, with something heavier, like iron, like anger not yet cooled. Jing's eyes moved to his hands. The knuckles were raw, a thin cut slicing across the back of one. She swallowed hard. "You found them." He nodded once, without looking up. "What did you do?" Her voice barely reached him, a whisper pressed into the air between them. He glanced at the fire, the glow flickering in his eyes like something held tight beneath the surface. "I paid their debts." She frowned, not understanding. "Debts?" He turned toward her then, slow and deliberate. "They owed the barkeep, the blacksmith, half the town. I made it right." "Now they know I know." Jing stared at him, the meaning of his words sinking slowly, painfully. "That won't stop them," she said softly. "No." His voice was steady, but there was weariness there too. "It won't." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of firewood and the quiet drip of rain from his coat onto the floorboards. Jing felt something shift in her chest, a mix of fear, anger, and a strange, aching gratitude. He had not struck back with rage. He had chosen a quieter form of defiance, one that humiliated without blood. Yet she knew what men like that did when humiliated. "You shouldn't have done it," she whispered, her hands twisting in the folds of her shawl. "You'll make them hate you more." He looked at her then, not as a man scolded, but as one who had already accepted his fate. "They already do." The words landed heavy, final. Jing turned away, her breath trembling. The rain began again, soft against the window pane, like the heartbeat of the earth trying to soothe what could not be undone. Later, she found him outside, repairing a loose board on the barn. The air smelled of mud and sunlight breaking through clouds. He worked in silence, each movement calm, purposeful. Jing approached slowly, her shawl trailing in the wind. "You are not bound to me," she said quietly. "I can leave if it will keep them from you." He stopped, hammer halfway raised. His shoulders tensed, then stilled. After a long pause, he set the hammer down and turned to face her. "Do you wish to leave?" She looked down. "No." He studied her face, the fading bruise, the trembling hands, the courage beneath her fear. Then he nodded once. "Then that's enough." Something broke softly inside her at those words. They were not dramatic, not romantic in the way of stories, but they were real. They were home. That night, as the sun sank behind the cottonwoods, Jing lit a single candle by her bedside. The flame trembled in the draught, throwing soft light across the walls. She whispered prayers again, but this time they were different, less desperate, more thankful. The house no longer felt like a stranger's place. The silence between her and Jackie had changed. It no longer carried distance, but understanding. Healing, slow and unseen, had begun to root itself in the quiet spaces of their days. But beyond the ranch, the town was stirring. Rumors had wings, and they flew faster than the prairie wind. Whispers began to curl through saloons and shops like smoke. Sutherland took in a Chinese woman. Some spoke with disgust, others with a kind of rough admiration. Old men spat into the dirt, muttering about pride and race. Women crossed the street when Jing passed. Even the children, catching their parents' tones, stared or laughed. The world was changing, and not kindly. Jing bore it in silence. She walked through town with her head low, the weight of eyes pressing against her like stones. At the general store, Mrs. Alcott, who had once offered her tea, now looked away as she handed over a sack of flour. No words, just the scrape of coins on wood. Jing thanked her anyway, voice steady, though her heart trembled. When she returned home that evening, Jackie was in the barn again, tending to a restless mare. He looked up as she entered, his gaze sharp enough to read her sorrow without needing words. She said nothing, but he took the basket from her arms, setting it down gently on the bench. "I can face them," she murmured after a moment. He shook his head. "You shouldn't have to." The way he said it, quiet, resolute, made her chest tighten. She wanted to tell him she had been facing cruelty her whole life, that endurance had been her only weapon, but the tenderness in his eyes stopped her. For the first time she allowed herself to rest, just a little, in the safety of someone else's strength. The following day brought an unexpected visitor. A woman rode in from the far ridge, tall, sharp-featured, her posture confident even in the saddle. She dismounted with ease and walked straight to the porch. Jing froze by the window until she heard the woman's voice, low, steady, carrying a hint of the same calm as Jackie's. "Martha," Jing whispered when Jackie called her name. His sister, Martha Sutherland, was not like the women in town. Her eyes were shrewd but kind, her hands rough from work, not idle gossip. She entered the kitchen, glanced around, then set down her gloves. "Folks are talking," she said plainly. "They'll talk worse before long." Jing's hands trembled slightly around the wooden spoon she held. "I know." Martha studied her, then softened. "Don't let them break you, girl. They talk because they don't understand strength when they see it." Jing blinked, the unexpected kindness striking her deeper than cruelty ever could. Martha reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of fabric, a shawl finely stitched with small flowers. "The wind's turning colder," she said simply. "You might need this." Jing's throat tightened. She touched the cloth as if it were something sacred. "Thank you." Jackie had been leaning quietly in the doorway, watching. Something in his chest eased at the sight, the rare, fragile bridge between two worlds that had always refused to touch. When Martha left that evening, the sky had already blushed into gold and lavender. Jing stood on the porch, clutching the shawl close, her heart warmed by the unexpected tenderness of a stranger. She looked toward the fields where Jackie worked, his figure bent against the sun, and for the first time she felt something she had long forgotten: belonging. Days folded into one another. Jing's fear did not vanish, but it dulled, softened by routine, by his presence, by the healing rhythm of the land. Each morning she rose to the smell of coffee and dew. Each night she fell asleep to the murmur of rain against the roof and the low hum of his voice in the barn. And something small but fierce began to grow between them. Not spoken love, not the grand kind sung in songs, but a love that moved quietly, that took root in gestures, the way he left wildflowers by her window, or the way she mended his coat without being asked. Two souls learning the language of care after too many years of silence. Sometimes, as dusk settled over the prairie, Jing would find herself standing outside, watching the sky melt into shades of rose and amber. She would close her eyes and breathe, letting the cool wind carry away her fears, letting her heart rest in the vastness of it all. And somewhere behind her she would hear the slow, steady footsteps of Jackie returning from the fields. She would not turn. She didn't need to. His presence was enough. The world was still cruel beyond the cottonwoods, but here, in this fragile corner of it, they had built a small sanctuary, and though storms were still gathering on distant horizons, for the first time in a long while, Jing dared to believe that healing was not just a word, but a way of living. The evening light drifted through the kitchen window, painting everything in gold. Jackie sat by the table, the faintest smile ghosting his lips as he watched her stir the stew. She felt his gaze and looked up, meeting his eyes. For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them was soft, warm, full of things yet to be said. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain and renewal. Inside, two hearts learned, slowly and quietly, how to beat together. The world beyond would not understand, not yet, but love, in its truest form, never asked for permission. It simply bloomed, even in the harshest soil. And somewhere deep within both of them, something whispered. Gentle, steady, sure, this is only the beginning. The days turned long and golden as summer settled over the plains, each dawn unfolding like a quiet promise. The land shimmered under the heat, the scent of wildflowers mingling with dust and sunlight. Cattle grazed lazily across the open fields, and the sound of cicadas rose in steady rhythm with the wind. From the porch, the ranch looked like a painting, simple, serene, touched by a rare kind of peace. But beneath that calm, something deeper stirred. Jackie had become quieter, though not distant. His silence carried thought now, not weariness. He rose early, tending to the herds, the fences, the endless labor that filled a rancher's life, but his gaze often wandered toward the kitchen window where Jing worked. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of her, hair tied loosely, sleeves rolled high, laughter catching in her throat as she wiped flour from her face. That laughter was rare still, but when it came, it warmed the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Jing, too, had changed. The fear that once wrapped around her like a second skin had begun to loosen its hold. She moved through the house with growing ease, humming soft melodies from her homeland. At night, she wrote small lines of poetry on scraps of parchment, memories of mountains and rivers, of lanterns and ocean wind, and tucked them into the corners of drawers like blessings. The walls of the ranch, once heavy with solitude, now held her presence like a gentle pulse. Yet the town had not forgotten. Whispers still drifted through the saloon, through the church pews and dusty markets. Some men spat her name as if it were a stain. Others spoke it softer, as though curious about the foreign girl who had softened the giant of the Sutherland ranch. But Jackie remained unbothered. He carried himself as he always had, firm, unyielding, but now with a quiet steadiness that came from knowing what was worth protecting. One afternoon, the sky burned white with heat. Jing stood near the corral, shading her eyes as she watched Jackie work a young horse that had thrown its rider the week before. The animal was spirited, tossing its mane, eyes wild with mistrust. Jackie's voice was calm, low as thunder in the distance, each movement deliberate. He didn't fight the creature, he listened to it, matching its breath, waiting until fear gave way to understanding. Jing watched, mesmerized. It was like watching the land itself learn gentleness again. When the horse finally stilled, Jackie stepped back, letting it circle him freely. Then, without looking at her, he called out, "You should try." Her heart stumbled. "Me?" He turned, wiping his brow with his sleeve, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "She won't trust me fully. She needs a lighter hand." Jing shook her head quickly, fear and disbelief tangling in her chest. "I've never ridden before." "You will," he said simply, and began walking toward her. She wanted to refuse, to hide behind reason and fear, but something in his eyes, the soft steadiness there, held her still. When he stopped in front of her, close enough for her to smell the faint mix of leather and cedar that clung to him, her breath caught. He lifted the reins, holding them out between them. "She's gentle now. I won't let you fall." Jing hesitated, fingers trembling as she reached out. The horse snorted, impatient, but Jackie's hand steadied hers. Slowly, he guided her foot into the stirrup, his touch firm yet careful. The warmth of his palm lingered against her waist as she swung into the saddle. For a heartbeat she froze, afraid of the height, of the power beneath her. But then she heard his voice again, low and even. "Breathe." She did. The world expanded. The wind touched her hair, the air thick with sunlight and the scent of hay. The horse shifted beneath her, waiting for her cue. Jackie stepped beside her, his hand still resting lightly at her knee, grounding her. "Now," he said quietly, "let her move." She loosened the reins. The mare began to walk, slowly at first, then more confidently. Jing's laughter came sudden, surprised, bright as bells in the still air. It startled the birds from the fence posts and made Jackie look up, his chest tightening with something that felt dangerously close to joy. He hadn't heard laughter like that in years, not in his house, not in his heart. When she turned back to him, cheeks flushed, eyes shining, he saw it. The woman she had been before the world bruised her. Not the cook, not the refugee, not the girl carrying her pain in silence, but a soul reclaiming its light. That night, the house glowed warmer than ever. Jing set a bowl of stew before him, her hair loose from the wind, her smile softer than the lamplight. Jackie ate in quiet, as he always did, but every few moments his gaze lifted to her, lingering longer than before. After dinner, he stepped outside to smoke. The stars were thick above, their light scattered like salt across black velvet. Jing followed him quietly, wrapping the shawl Martha had given her around her shoulders. She stood beside him on the porch, eyes turned skyward. "The stars here are different," she said softly. "In China they looked closer, like you could reach them if you climbed high enough." He nodded, his voice a low rumble. "Here they're just far enough to remind us what we're missing." They stood in silence. The night air was cool, the sound of crickets weaving through the quiet. After a long while, Jing said, "You never asked me about where I came from." Jackie exhaled slowly, watching the smoke drift upward. "Didn't need to. You're here now." The simplicity of it struck her deeper than any confession could. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You make it sound easy." "Nothing's easy," he said, turning toward her. "But some things are worth the trouble." The wind lifted her hair, and for a moment the distance between them vanished. They didn't move closer. They didn't need to. The quiet held everything. Days passed, and the world seemed to soften around them. Jing began to wake with peace instead of fear. She started singing while she worked, small lilting tunes that drifted through the house like incense. Jackie didn't comment, but sometimes he paused at the door just to listen, his heart settling with each note. But peace is a fragile thing. The Yates brothers, humiliated and burning with resentment, began to stir trouble again. Their words spread faster than their fists ever could, poison disguised as pride. "Sutherland's gone soft," they sneered in the saloon, "hiding behind some foreign skirt." Men laughed, their bitterness feeding off one another, while whiskey loosened their tongues. By the time the moon climbed high, half the town had heard the story twisted into something cruel. Jing sensed it before Jackie did. She felt the shift in the air, the way people's stares turned sharper when she went to town, the laughter that stopped when she passed. One afternoon, she saw the brothers across the street, Franklin's grin mean and small, Carl's eyes cold. She looked away quickly, clutching her basket, her pulse racing. When she reached home, Jackie was in the yard splitting firewood. He looked up immediately, reading the tension in her face. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said too quickly, then hesitated. "They were there, watching." Jackie's jaw tightened, the axe motionless in his hand. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with quiet restraint, he returned to his work, each strike sharper, cleaner, more controlled. She knew what that silence meant. It was how he carried anger, not with shouts, but with precision. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, and in the distance thunder rolled over the plains. She sat by the fire, her shawl drawn close, thinking of the men, of the town, of the storm that seemed to be gathering again. Jackie entered the room, his steps soft but certain. He crouched beside her, the firelight glinting off his eyes. "You're safe here," he said quietly. She met his gaze. "They'll come again." He didn't deny it. "Then let them." "I've met storms before." His words were simple, but they rooted deep within her. She realized then that strength wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to stand anyway. And in that moment, something inside her steadied. The storm outside broke. Rain pounded against the roof, wind tearing at the shutters. Jackie rose and went to the window, closing it firmly. When he turned back, Jing was still watching him, her expression unreadable, her heart heavy and full. "Why do you protect me?" she asked. He hesitated, his back half turned to her, his voice almost lost beneath the rain. "Because someone should have, long before me." She swallowed hard, tears welling. "And who protected you?" He didn't answer, but the silence that followed said enough. The night stretched long, but neither felt alone anymore. They sat together by the dying fire, the storm raging outside, the world trying its best to break them, and yet within that small room a fragile kind of peace held strong. When dawn came, the land shimmered once more under the cleansing rain. The cottonwoods stood tall, their leaves dripping silver. Jing stepped onto the porch, the air cool and sweet. Jackie joined her, coffee in hand, the faintest smile ghosting his lips as he watched her breathe in the morning. The storm had passed, but both knew others would come. Still, neither spoke of it. There was no need. The heart doesn't need promises when it already understands the truth. Some souls are meant to stand together against whatever the wind brings. The prairie stretched wide before them, endless and healing, and somewhere in the hush of that morning light, love, quiet, steady, unspoken, kept growing, like roots deep beneath the soil, unseen but unbreakable. The days grew quieter after the storm, but silence in the west was never without meaning. The prairie stretched endless, shimmering under a mild sun, yet beneath its calm beat a slower, heavier rhythm, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Jackie worked the fields with deliberate ease. his movements steady as ever, his face unreadable, though Jing had begun to learn the language of his silences. She could tell when worry settled behind his eyes, when thoughts pressed heavy against his jawline, when he was fighting something he would never name aloud. The town still whispered. It always did. Rumors clung to small places like dust. They said the rancher had gone soft, that the Chinese girl had bewitched him, that the West itself was changing because he let her stay. Words twisted like barbed wire passed from mouth to mouth in the flickering haze of lamplight. But Jackie didn't answer words with words. He answered them with quiet endurance, with work, with a dignity so calm it unsettled those who tried to hate him. Jing carried the weight of it differently. She felt each glance like a cold wind, sharp and invisible. On market days, she wrapped her shawl tighter and walked with her head lowered. Men leaned against wooden posts, their voices dipping into laughter when she passed. Women drew their children closer, as though shame could be contagious. Jing said nothing, but inside her heart bruised again in places no one could see. When she returned home, she hid her trembling hands in the folds of her skirt. She smiled as she prepared supper, smiled as she set the table, but Jackie saw. He always saw. That evening, he said little, only took the basket from her hands and brushed the dust from her sleeve, his touch slow, almost reverent. She looked up at him then, and though he spoke no words of comfort, she felt them. In his eyes there was no judgment, only a steady warmth that healed in ways she didn't yet understand. The next morning, the horizon glowed rose-gold with dawn. Jing was kneading dough when the sound of hooves came from afar. She turned toward the window, expecting Jackie returning from the barn, but it was a rider she didn't know. The woman dismounted with practiced grace, dust swirling around her boots. She had the same strong shoulders, the same stillness in her stance as Jackie. When she stepped into the light, Jing understood. Martha Sutherland. Jackie's sister was older by a few years, her face weathered by both work and wisdom. She walked into the kitchen like a wind that carried both warning and warmth. Jing stood frozen, unsure whether to curtsy or flee. Martha studied her quietly for a long moment, then smiled, not the kind that pitied, but the kind that recognized. "I'm told you make bread worth the ride," she said simply. Relief loosened something in Jing's chest. "I hope it's enough." Martha nodded and sat. For a moment, silence. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "Folks in town are talking. They'll talk worse before long." Jing's hands tightened around the dough. "I know." Martha leaned forward, elbows on the table, her gaze steady. "Don't let them grind you down. They talk because they're afraid of what they don't understand. That kind of fear makes people cruel." The words sank deep, gentle but strong. Jing blinked back the sting in her eyes. Before leaving, Martha reached into her satchel and placed a folded shawl on the table. It was soft, embroidered with wildflowers in careful stitches. "The wind bites out here. Thought you could use this." Jing touched it with trembling fingers. "Thank you." Martha smiled, brief but kind. "Don't thank me. Just keep standing." Jackie had been leaning in the doorway all along, silent, his expression unreadable. When Martha glanced at him, something unspoken passed between them. Old understanding, old love, old warning. As she rode away, Jing turned to him, holding the shawl close. "She's kind," she murmured. Jackie's voice was quiet. Always has been. That night, Jing placed the shawl by her bed and lay awake, tracing the embroidered flowers with her fingertips. It was the first gift she'd received since leaving her homeland. Small, simple, but it carried a kind of grace she hadn't felt in years, the grace of being seen as human, as deserving of warmth. In the days that followed, something changed between them. Their routines wove tighter, their quiet exchanges deeper. Jackie started leaving small things by her window. A feather, a river stone, a bundle of lavender he found growing wild. Jing mended his shirt without asking, placed tea by his bedside, polished his boots when he returned late. The gestures were wordless, but each one whispered of care. One afternoon, as the sun lowered in molten streaks across the sky, Jackie called her out to the corral. "I want to show you something," he said, voice low. A young chestnut mare tossed her head inside the pen, her coat shining like copper in the light. Jing hesitated, stepping closer. "She's restless," he said, his hand resting on the fence. "Needs a gentler touch than mine." Jing shook her head. "I can't." "Yes," he said softly, "you can." He opened the gate. The mare shifted nervously, but didn't bolt. Jackie guided Jing forward, his hand steady at her back. "Let her feel your calm." Jing's heart thundered. Her breath came shallow, but she extended her hand. The mare's warm breath brushed her palm, soft and uncertain. When the animal didn't pull away, Jing laughed, a sound so light it startled even her. Jackie's gaze softened, his lips curving slightly. "You see?" he murmured. "She trusts you. Trust." The word lingered between them like something sacred. That night, as they sat on the porch, the world bathed in the soft hues of twilight, Jing whispered, "You make everything sound simple." Jackie looked toward the horizon. Simple doesn't mean easy. The wind stirred the grass, and for a moment the sky seemed to fold around them, a tender hush holding their shared silence. She turned to him, watching how the fading light carved lines across his face, lines of strength, of loss, of something unspoken but deeply kind. "Why do you care for me?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "Because you've carried enough alone." Her breath caught, tears gathering before she could stop them. He looked at her then, eyes steady and gentle. "You don't have to be strong all the time." The words broke something open in her. For so long she had survived by silence, by hiding pain beneath composure. Now, in his voice, she heard permission to rest. She looked down, her hands trembling. "I don't know how," she whispered. Jackie reached out, barely touching her hand. "You'll learn." The touch was brief, but filled with a quiet promise, the kind that needed no vows. In the following weeks, they found a rhythm that felt almost like peace. But peace, Jing learned, always lived on borrowed time. The whispers from town grew sharper. The Yates brothers gathered men over whiskey and pride. They called her names, twisted her story into something ugly, and by the time the harvest moon rose, half the town was repeating it. Jing felt it in the air, the tension, the slow gathering of resentment. Yet, amid it all, the ranch remained their refuge. Each dawn began with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Each night ended with the soft murmur of wind through cottonwoods. Healing, she realized, was not the absence of pain. It was the courage to build something gentle in a world that wasn't. One evening she stood by the window, watching lightning bloom far off on the horizon. Jackie came to stand beside her, his presence grounding as ever. "Storm's coming," he said. She nodded. "They always do." He turned to her, his voice low. "And they always pass." The rain began to fall, soft at first, like a lullaby over the earth. Jing closed her eyes, letting the sound wash through her, steadying the fragile rhythm of her heart. She felt his warmth beside her, solid and wordless, and for the first time she understood this was what safety felt like. Not walls, not silence, but someone who stood beside you when the world turned cruel. As the storm deepened outside, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak, but she felt his breath steady, slow, calm as the rain. The moment stretched long and golden in her memory, like a candle flame that would never die. Outside, thunder rolled far across the plain, and the night hummed with the scent of rain and earth. Inside, two hearts rested, still beating from the ache of the past, yet quietly mending together. The prairie whispered beyond the walls, vast and ancient, as if it too approved of this small miracle. A man who had lost his voice to grief, and a woman who had found hers again in his silence. And far off, beyond the cottonwoods, the darkness gathered once more, but neither of them turned to look. Some storms, they had learned, are best met hand in hand beneath the same quiet sky. The world turned soft again after the rain. Dew gathered on the grass like pearls at dawn, and the wind carried the smell of wet earth and wildflowers. The ranch stood calm, washed clean, as if the land itself wanted to forget what had been whispered against it. Days bled into one another gently. No grand miracles, just the small, healing rhythm of living. Jackie rose early, as always, moving with the patience of a man who knew every sound of his home by heart. Jing watched him sometimes through the kitchen window, the way his frame seemed to belong to the morning light, how the horses followed his voice as though they trusted it more than the wind itself. Each morning began with bread and warmth. Jing had started adding herbs to the dough, mint, sage, wild thyme she gathered near the fence, and the smell filled the house like sunlight. Jackie never said much, but he noticed everything. He would take a piece quietly, nod once in approval, and she would pretend not to see the faint curve of his mouth that meant gratitude. The bruise on her face had long faded, but its ghost still lived in her heart. There were nights when she woke with a start, the echo of cruel laughter still lingering in her ears, and the memory of hands that had treated her like an object, not a woman. In those moments she would wrap her shawl around her shoulders and step outside, breathing the night air until calm returned. Sometimes Jackie would be there already, sitting on the porch, smoking in silence. He never asked what haunted her. He just shared the quiet. That was his way of healing her. Not with questions, but with presence. Over time, their silences began to feel like conversations. They could sit for hours and say nothing, and yet every glance, every small movement between them spoke of trust, of comfort, of something growing steady and deep. Jing had not known love could be this quiet. She had thought love was all fire and desperation, but here it was like rain, constant, nourishing, unseen by those who only looked for thunder. Jackie began teaching her small things about the land, how to read the sky for signs of storm, how to calm a nervous horse by breathing slow, how to plant wildflowers that could survive drought. They worked side by side, the space between them shrinking without their realizing it. When he showed her how to mend a broken bridle, their hands brushed just for a heartbeat. But that brief contact carried more warmth than 100 words. Her heart fluttered, shy but alive, as though something inside her had finally begun to bloom after years of winter. At night, she cooked over the hearth while he sat at the table fixing a lantern or sharpening a tool. The golden light softened the lines of his face, revealing the gentleness that life had buried under dust and duty. Sometimes she would tell him small stories about her childhood by the river, about her mother's songs, about the way the moonlight looked on temple roofs back home. Jackie would listen without interruption, his eyes fixed on her like he was memorizing every word. He rarely spoke of himself, but once when she asked if he had ever been married, he said quietly, "Once, a long time ago. She didn't stay." He didn't explain, and Jing didn't ask. The sadness in his voice said enough. She understood then why he carried silence the way some men carried scars. It was the shape of what had been lost. The next day, the sky turned overcast. The wind shifted, cool and sharp, carrying the smell of rain again. Jackie was mending the roof when he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. Old Jeremiah Clean, white beard, eyes sharp as a hawk's, the kind of man whose words carried the weight of the prairie. Jackie climbed down as Jeremiah stopped by the gate. "You're making enemies you don't need," the old man said, voice rough. "That girl's marked now. So are you." Jackie said nothing. Jeremiah sighed. "You can't fight the world, son. Folks don't forgive easy when pride's been bruised." Jackie looked past him toward the fields that stretched forever. "I'm not asking them to forgive, just to stay out of my way." The old man shook his head. "You're a fool, but a good one." Then he turned his horse and rode off, leaving behind a trail of dust that caught the dying light. Jing heard about the visit later that evening. She said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the stew. Jackie noticed. He walked over, lifted the spoon from her hand, and set it down gently. "They'll come for me before they come for you," he said. She met his eyes, her breath quickening. "That's not comfort." "It's truth," he replied. Then, after a pause, softer. "But they won't find me afraid." She turned away before he could see the tears forming. Fear wasn't new to her, but this was different. It wasn't the fear of being hurt. It was the fear of losing the only soul who had ever stood between her and the cruelty of the world. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the shawl Martha had given her wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The moonlight touched her face, and she felt the weight of everything, the whispers, the distance, the inevitable storm she knew was coming. Her life had always been running, from men, from shame, from the past. But now she found herself praying not for escape, but for courage to stay. The next morning dawned golden and peaceful, as if the world wanted to deceive them. Jackie saddled his horse and rode to the western fields. Jing followed him with her gaze until he disappeared beyond the hills. She spent the day tending the garden, her thoughts distant, her heart restless. When he returned at dusk, the light behind him painted the sky crimson. He looked tired but calm. He handed her a small cluster of prairie roses, their petals pale as dawn. "They grow near the river," he said simply. Jing took them, her fingers brushing his. "They're beautiful." "They're stubborn," he said. "They grow even after the frost." She smiled faintly. "Like people. Like you," he said quietly. The words settled between them, soft and certain. Jing looked away, her cheeks warm. The simple kindness of his voice filled her chest with something that hurt and healed all at once. That evening, while the stew simmered, she began to hum again, one of her mother's songs, low and tender. Jackie sat on the porch, the melody drifting through the open door. It wrapped around him like a gentle memory, something that made the air sweeter, the world smaller, and the ache of his loneliness almost bearable. He realized then that love didn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, on soft feet, through ordinary days that began to feel like grace. As summer began to fade, the prairie turned gold again. Jing hung herbs to dry by the window. Jackie repaired the fences one post at a time. Their movements had become a duet of sorts, steady, wordless, bound by trust. One afternoon, as they stood together watching the sunset, Jing said, "The sky here is so wide it makes me feel small." Jackie looked toward the horizon. "It makes me feel whole." She smiled, her heart catching in her chest. "Maybe both are the same thing." He turned to her then, his eyes soft. "Maybe they are." They stood like that for a long while, bathed in the fading gold of the day, the air filled with the scent of earth and evening rain. The wind brushed her hair across her face, and he reached up, instinctively, to tuck it behind her ear. His hand lingered for a heartbeat, then fell away. The world held still. No words passed, but the silence between them pulsed with everything unsaid. The gratitude, the tenderness, the longing that neither dared to name. Later that night, as they sat by the hearth, Jing rested her hands near the fire and said softly, "I used to think love was something people like me weren't meant to have." Jackie stared into the flames. "And now?" "Now, I think it's just something that takes its time finding you." He looked at her then, and the quiet that followed felt like an answer. Outside, the wind moved through the grass like an old song, slow and healing. The stars rose, one by one, over the cottonwoods, shining brighter than before. In that moment, neither of them thought of the past or of the trouble still lurking beyond the horizon. For once, the world felt simple. Two souls standing in the same light, breathing the same air, learning that love could exist even here, in a place carved by storms and silence. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew something had shifted forever. The land had seen it, the wind had carried it, and the night itself seemed to whisper it back to them. Love had taken root, and no force on earth could tear it out. The air began to shift with the coming of autumn. Mornings turned cool, the mist thick along the pastures, and the prairie grasses glowed amber in the light. The cottonwoods had started to turn, their leaves whispering secrets with every gust of wind. Life at the ranch moved quietly, but there was an unease beneath the calm, something gathering at the edge of the horizon, unseen but certain, like the build of a storm that hadn't yet found its sky. Jing felt it before she could name it. Some instinct, old as survival itself, told her peace never lasted too long. Still, she tried to hold on to the small, steady moments. Jackie's quiet presence in the mornings, the way the horses leaned their heads into his hands, the smell of coffee and rain that lingered in the air. She had begun to trust these things, begun to believe the world could be gentle. But the heart, once broken too many times, always keeps an ear turned toward thunder. In town, the whispers had grown into something uglier. The Yates brothers had returned to their drinking and their scheming, their pride festering under the weight of humiliation. Men who had once traded with Jackie now avoided his eyes. The stories changed with every telling, becoming darker, crueler, easier to believe for those who needed someone to blame for the slow decay of their lives. A rancher turned fool, they said, a foreign woman corrupting him. The poison of it spread like wildfire through dry grass. Jackie knew. He didn't need words to hear it. He could feel the distance when he rode through town, the way conversation stopped when he passed, the way men's hands lingered on the grips of their belts. But he didn't answer. He was not a man built for shouting wars with small minds. He believed the land had its own justice, the slow, patient kind that wore down mountains. Yet even patience cannot hold forever when cruelty sharpens its teeth. It was a Sunday when Martha came again, riding fast, her bonnet tied tight against the wind. Jing met her by the gate, her heart lurching at the look on the woman's face. "They're talking about coming here," Martha said, her voice taut. "A few of them, the Yates brothers leading. Drunk talk for now, but talk has a way of turning into action when the bottle runs dry." Jackie appeared from the barn, wiping his hands. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Martha finished, he only nodded once. "You can still come stay at my place," she said sharply. "Both of you. It's safer north." Jackie shook his head. "Running never changed a man's heart." Martha stared at him, frustration breaking through her composure. "And standing still never stopped a bullet." He didn't answer. His eyes met Jing's briefly, steady, quiet, full of something that both frightened and comforted her. Martha sighed, pulling her gloves tight. "You always were too proud," she muttered, then softened. "But you've always stood for what's right. Be careful, brother." When she rode off, the dust rose in small ghosts behind her horse. Jing watched until she vanished beyond the ridge. That evening the sky burned crimson as the sun fell. Jackie moved through the barn, checking the hinges, tightening the locks, though he said it was just habit. Jing followed him silently, her hands brushing over the worn wood of the stalls. The air smelled of hay and earth, and for a moment she imagined this was all life would ever be. Just the two of them, the quiet rhythm of work and breath, the slow healing of ordinary days. But the heart always knows when something sacred is about to be tested. After supper, Jackie sat by the fire, his hat resting on his knee. Jing stitched near the window, the flicker of candlelight painting her face in gold. They didn't speak much. Words seemed too small for what hung between them. Finally he said, "If it comes to trouble, I want you to stay inside." Her hands stilled. "And let them hurt you?" "I've handled worse." "No," she said softly, her voice trembling but firm. "Not for me." He looked at her then, the firelight catching the quiet steel in his eyes. "Not for you," he said, "for what's right." She didn't answer. The silence that followed was thick and tender, heavy with everything that could not be spoken aloud. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the wind push against the shutters, to the distant sound of coyotes howling under a bruised moon. The air carried the scent of rain. Something inside her ached with a knowledge she didn't want. To love someone brave was to live in constant fear of losing them. Before dawn, she rose and went to the porch. The world was silver with mist. Jackie was already there, sitting on the steps, the faint outline of his rifle leaning against the rail. He didn't turn when she came, but she knew he felt her presence. "I used to pray for safety," she said quietly, "but it never came. Maybe that's not what prayers are for." Jackie's voice was low, almost a whisper. "What are they for, then? For peace, maybe. For the strength to face what comes." He nodded slowly. "You've got more strength than most men I've met." Her eyes glistened. "And you've got more kindness than this land deserves." They sat together until the sun broke through the fog, the light spilling over the fields like mercy. For a moment, everything felt still, timeless, suspended between dread and grace. But that stillness didn't last. By afternoon, the horizon had darkened. Storm clouds gathered low, thick and heavy, the air humming with electricity. Jackie worked in silence, sharpening a blade, oiling the hinges on the doors. Jing cooked as if the act itself could anchor her to something solid. The smell of bread filled the house, mixing with the scent of metal and rain. As dusk fell, she saw it, small pinpricks of light moving through the distance, torches. Her breath caught. "They're coming," she whispered. Jackie rose, steady as stone. He took his rifle, checked the chamber, then set it aside deliberately. "I won't start it," he said, "but I'll end it if I must." Her heart pounded, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to them." He stepped close, his hands rough and warm as they brushed her cheek. "It's not them I'm proving it to." Outside, thunder rumbled. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the roof like impatient fingers. The torches drew closer, their glow flickering through the sheets of rain. The men's voices carried faintly, drunken, angry, fearless in their foolishness. Jing clutched the window frame, her pulse racing. She saw the shapes emerging from the dark, 7, maybe 8 of them. Franklin Yates at the front, his brother beside him, faces mean and eager. Jackie stepped out onto the porch, rain already slicking his hair. He didn't raise his weapon. He stood bare-chested in the downpour, his eyes calm, his breath steady. Franklin sneered, lifting his torch higher. "We came for what don't belong here." Jackie's voice cut through the rain, low and even. "You came to shame yourselves again." Carl spat into the mud. "You think this land's yours to fill with filth?" Jackie didn't flinch. "This land's mine to fill with what's decent, and she's under my roof. That makes her mine to protect." The words hung heavy, thunder rolling behind them like an amen. Franklin lunged first, torch swinging. Jackie caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him sprawling into the mud. Carl charged next, his bulk crashing forward, but Jackie met him head-on. They collided like two storms breaking. Fists, rain, mud. It blurred together, brutal and wordless. Inside, Jing stood frozen, her heart tearing with every sound. She wanted to run to him, to stop it, but fear rooted her to the floor. She watched through the glass as lightning illuminated the chaos. Jackie moving like a man who carried the weight of every injustice he'd ever seen. He didn't kill. He didn't even strike with cruelty. Each blow was measured, precise, the strength of a man defending life, not taking it. The torches fell one by one, hissing in the mud. Franklin stumbled up again, blood running from his brow. "You'll pay for this," he shouted. Jackie turned slowly, his chest heaving, eyes blazing through the rain. "Then come back with more. Bring the whole town if you need to. I'll be standing here still." The courage in those words cut through their drunken rage like lightning through cloud. One by one they faltered, dragging each other away, their torches fading into the storm. When the last shadow disappeared, the rain fell harder, washing blood and mud into the earth. Jackie stood in the yard, breathing hard, soaked to the bone. He turned toward the house just as the door burst open. Xing ran to him, barefoot, her shawl trailing behind her. She dropped to her knees in the mud, her hands reaching for him. "You could have died," she cried, her voice breaking. He caught her wrists gently, his touch trembling but sure. "Better me than you." She pressed her forehead to his chest, her tears mingling with the rain. The warmth of him, the solid heartbeat beneath her cheek, was the most human sound she had ever known. They stayed there for a long time, the storm raging around them, the prairie humming with the sound of renewal. When at last they rose, the night had softened, and the clouds began to break apart, revealing a few brave stars. Inside, Jing cleaned his cuts, her hands tender, her silence full of love. Jackie watched her move about the room, the small furrow of her brow, the calm precision of her care. Outside, the prairie exhaled, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath for them. When she finished, she met his gaze, her eyes shining. "You stood for me," she said softly. He shook his head. "I stood for what was right." She smiled through her tears. "It's the same thing." He reached for her hand then, and this time she didn't pull away. The fire crackled softly, the scent of rain drifting through the open window. Beyond it, the land stretched wide and forgiving, cleansed once again. And though the storm had passed, both knew others would come. But now, neither faced them alone. Love, like the prairie, was vast, quiet, fierce, and unbroken. And somewhere in that endless dark, under stars that refused to fade, two hearts finally learned what it meant to belong. The sun rose pale the next morning, spilling soft light across a world washed clean by the night's storm. The air was still wet with memory, the scent of rain and earth heavy in every breath. The yard was a field of mud where the torches had died, the broken prints of boots already filling with water. Yet there was peace in it, the kind that comes after survival, the quiet that feels like a prayer whispered by the sky itself. Jing woke before dawn, her body aching from exhaustion, her heart tender as new skin. The first thing she saw was him. Jackie sat by the hearth, head bowed, his hands wrapped in clean bandages, the firelight painting his face in slow-moving gold. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was even, steady, like the rhythm of the land outside. She stood there for a while, watching him, letting the sight root her. He had fought for her, not out of pride or duty, but something truer, something that didn't need to be named. She moved quietly, pouring water into a basin, washing her hands, her movements calm but heavy with gratitude. The sound of water filled the silence, and Jackie stirred, lifting his head. Their eyes met across the room. No words passed, but the world between them was full. She brought him tea, steam curling in the cool air. "You should rest," she said softly. "I will," he replied, though she knew he wouldn't. His kind of rest was in the quiet work that followed every storm, the mending of fences, the tending of soil, the rebuilding of what violence had broken. For a long time they sat in the hush of the morning. Outside, birds began to call again, their songs tentative but growing. The light grew stronger, touching everything it could reach. The walls, the floor, the small scar on his temple, the trembling curve of her hand. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a softness that could only come from pain turned into understanding. I was never meant to be protected. All my life, I thought that was weakness, to need anyone. Jackie turned his gaze toward the window. Needing someone isn't weakness, he said quietly. It's what makes you human. She looked at him then, really looked. The man who had built his life from silence, who had buried his grief beneath work and weather, and yet had chosen to rise for her when no one else would. Something inside her broke open, not with sorrow, but with relief. She wanted to tell him that he had saved more than her life, that he had given her back her faith in goodness. But words felt too small. So instead she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly over his bandaged hand. He didn't move away. His skin was warm beneath hers, his pulse steady, the kind of strength that didn't boast, only existed. For a moment the world seemed to pause, their breaths, the wind, the faint ticking of the clock. All of it suspended in that fragile space between two hearts, learning to trust the same silence. As the day stretched forward, the land glimmered with the glow of renewal. Jackie went out to the fields, his gait slower but sure, while Jing cleaned the porch, sweeping away the mud left behind. Each stroke of the broom felt like an exorcism, a cleansing of all that had haunted her. She burned the last of the broken torches in the hearth, watched the smoke spiral upward, carrying the past away into the open sky. The townsfolk, meanwhile, could not ignore what had happened. The story spread, reshaped by mouths that feared and admired in equal measure. Some called Jackie a fool for standing up against his own kind. Others whispered that he'd done what no one else dared. Children, wide-eyed and breathless, repeated the tale in secret corners of the rancher who stood alone in the rain, unyielding as stone. When Jing next went to town, the air was different, not kinder, but quieter. Some still turned their faces, but others, those who'd heard the truth beneath the noise, nodded subtly as she passed. Mrs. Alcott hesitated before handing her the flower that week, but when their fingers brushed, she didn't pull away. "Heard the men didn't get far that night," she murmured. "World's got its own way of balancing things." Jing only nodded, her voice steady. "It does." She returned home with her basket full, but her heart lighter. The path back to the ranch shimmered under the afternoon sun, the hills golden with late-season blooms. She could see the figure of Jackie by the cottonwoods, mending a fence post, his shirt rolled to his elbows, the muscles in his arms moving like slow rivers beneath the skin. For a moment she simply watched him, her breath catching on something too tender to name. When he saw her, he straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. She walked the rest of the way to him, her shawl fluttering in the warm wind. "You shouldn't be working," she said, half smiling. He grinned faintly. "Can't let the land fall apart." "Nor yourself," she said. He looked at her then, that quiet smile still lingering, and something unspoken passed between them, a promise not made of words, but of presence. That evening, they ate outside beneath a sky painted with fading sunlight. The air smelled of hay and ripening fruit, and somewhere nearby, crickets began their song. Jing leaned back against the porch railing, her shawl loose around her shoulders, the firelight flickering across her face. Jackie sat beside her, his coffee cooling in his hands. After a long silence, he said, "You're not afraid anymore." She looked at him, her eyes soft but certain. "Fear still visits," she admitted, "but it doesn't stay, not here." He nodded, gaze drifting toward the horizon. "It's strange, isn't it, how the land teaches you to endure?" "Or maybe," she said quietly, "it teaches you to love what endures." The wind rose gently, carrying her words into the distance. The night wrapped around them like a soft cloak, and for once neither felt the weight of the world pressing down. There was only the sound of the wind through the grass, the creak of the rocking chair, the faint hum of life continuing in the dark. Later, as the fire burned low, Jing turned toward him. The moon had risen full, its silver light brushing over his face. "What will happen now?" she asked. Jackie took a deep breath, the air cool in his lungs. "They'll talk for a while, then they'll find someone else to hate. People always do." She tilted her head, her voice gentle. "And you?" He smiled faintly, eyes still on the land. "I'll keep building fences, feeding the horses, living. Maybe that's enough." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she moved closer, her hand finding his on the railing. His fingers curled around hers, firm and protective. The warmth of his touch traveled through her like a quiet fire, thawing the last frozen corners of her soul. They stayed that way until the stars thinned into dawn. The next morning, the prairie glowed gold again. The air was crisp, alive. Jing walked to the river with a basket of linens, her reflection trembling in the water as she worked. When she looked up, she saw Jackie by the fence line, hammer in hand, the rising sun cutting fire across his shoulders. A feeling washed through her, gentle, steady, complete. She realized then that she was no longer just surviving. She was living. She was home. When she returned, Jackie was waiting by the porch, a cluster of wildflowers in his hand, white prairie asters gathered from the edge of the fields. He held them out awkwardly, like a man unused to gestures. "They reminded me of you," he said. She took them, her smile trembling. "Because they're small?" He shook his head, the faintest warmth in his eyes. "Because they grow where nothing else dares." Her breath caught, laughter and tears tangled together. She stepped closer, brushing his arm lightly as she passed. "Then maybe we're the same." He turned, catching her gaze. "Maybe we are." That night, as the wind whispered through the cottonwoods and the stars gathered like scattered coins above the ranch, Jing stood at the door, watching the sky. Jackie came to stand beside her, the warmth of him grounding her once again. The air smelled of rain yet to fall, of earth that had forgiven, of beginnings that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Neither said anything. They didn't have to. The world had tried to break them, and yet here they stood, two souls forged in quiet defiance, healed not by grand gestures, but by the steady grace of choosing each other again and again. The night deepened. Somewhere far away, thunder murmured. Jing turned her face toward him, her voice a whisper. "Whatever comes, I'll stay." Jackie looked at her, eyes dark and steady. "Then so will I." The wind rose, carrying the promise into the dark, over the fields, across the sleeping town that would never quite understand them. But the land did. The land always did. And under that endless sky, washed in moonlight and memory, they stood together. Two hearts, weathered but whole, finally finding peace in the place where the storms had once been. The prairie had entered its gentlest season, the kind of late autumn where the light turns honey soft and everything moves slower, as if the earth itself were learning to breathe again. The air smelled of hay, smoke, and apple wood. The grass bowed golden under the weight of fading days. The ranch stood quiet, alive in its solitude, and for the first time, peace did not feel borrowed. It belonged to them now. Each morning began with the same rhythm, the whisper of wind, the soft clatter of dishes, the faint thud of boots against wood. Jing would wake to find Jackie already outside, mending a fence post or feeding the horses, his movements deliberate and calm. Sometimes she would carry him coffee, walking barefoot across the cool boards of the porch, the mug trembling slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from tenderness too vast to hold. He would take it, nod once, and she would stay there beside him, watching the horizon stretch forever, both of them wordless but full. Time had begun to feel different here. The days no longer passed in loneliness, but in quiet unfolding, like the slow blooming of wildflowers after rain. Jing noticed how Jackie had begun to hum softly while working, barely a tune, just a low vibration under his breath that matched the sound of the wind. She found herself singing again too, sometimes in her mother tongue, soft healing melodies that wrapped the mornings in warmth. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Jackie took her riding beyond the ridge. The sky burned in colors too wild for words, amber melting into rose, then into the deep blue of coming night. They rode side by side in silence, the horses' hooves muffled against the soft earth. When they reached the river, he stopped and dismounted, offering her his hand. She slid down gently, her fingers finding his. The contact was brief but steady, grounding her in the stillness of everything around them. The river ran slow, its surface turning silver under the falling light. Jing stood at the edge, gazing at her reflection, trembling in the water. Her face looked softer now, her eyes no longer carrying the shadow of things unsaid. Jackie came to stand beside her, his presence as natural as the wind. "I used to think this land was only made for surviving," he said quietly. "But maybe it's meant for starting over." She smiled faintly, her voice low. "And what about us?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe we're the proof." She didn't answer, but her hand found his again. They stood that way until the stars began to bloom above them, until the prairie became a vast ocean of dark and glittering light. The sound of the river filled the silence, soothing and eternal. In that moment, Jing realized she no longer felt like a stranger in this place. She was part of it, the wind, the soil, the sky, and the quiet man beside her. She was home. As the nights grew colder, they moved through the days like people who had built a small world of their own. The townsfolk still whispered, but less now, as though even gossip grew tired in the face of steadfastness. A few of them came back for trade. Some left baskets of food on the porch without a word. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to replace scorn. Perhaps it was time, or shame, or simply the realization that kindness could not be burned down. Martha visited again near the first frost. She brought jars of honey and news from town. "They've stopped talking," she said, setting the jars on the counter. "Or maybe they just ran out of lies." Jackie smiled, a rare, quiet curve of his lips. "About time." Martha looked between him and Jing, her eyes soft. "You did right by her, and she by you." Jing blushed, her hands folded in her lap. Martha reached out, touching her shoulder. "It's good to see peace on your face. You both earned it." When she left, the ranch felt different, lighter somehow, as though forgiveness had finally drifted through the door. Jing spent the rest of that afternoon drying herbs by the window, humming to herself. The sound filled the house with warmth, the kind that doesn't need fire to burn. That night, as they sat by the hearth, Jackie said, "When spring comes, I'll plant another field to the south. The soil's good there. We could grow wheat." Jing looked up from her sewing. "We?" He met her gaze, his voice low but firm. "Yes. We." Her smile was small, but her eyes shimmered with quiet joy. "Then I'll plant flowers by the edge, so the wind smells sweet when you work." He chuckled softly, shaking his head, always thinking ahead. "It's what keeps me alive," she said. He leaned back in his chair, studying her face, the way the firelight painted her skin gold, the softness in her expression, the unguarded peace that had taken years to find. "It's what keeps me alive too," he murmured. The weeks slipped by like pages turning in a well-loved book. The first frost came, dusting the fields with silver. Jing began knitting scarves for winter. Jackie repaired the barn roof. At night they sat by the fire, their shoulders brushing, their breaths in rhythm. The storms of the past had quieted, leaving behind the healing stillness of two people who no longer had to fight to be seen. Sometimes, when the night grew long and the wind howled beyond the walls, Jing would wake and listen to his breathing beside her. It was slow, sure, the sound of a man who had learned to rest. She would close her eyes again and smile, knowing she was no longer alone in her prayers. Winter came soft and deep. Snow blanketed the prairie, muting the world into a hush of white. Jackie chopped firewood in the yard, while Jing hung herbs in the kitchen, the scent of pine and cinnamon weaving through the air. They moved around each other with the ease of people who had learned the same rhythm of survival, his strength, her tenderness, both made of the same quiet courage. On the longest night of the year, they stood outside together, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the aurora shimmer faintly above the horizon. The lights moved like waves, green and violet, soft as silk. Jing leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day, if you hadn't noticed me?" He was silent for a long time before answering. "Maybe the world would have gone on just the same, but I wouldn't have." Her eyes filled, the cold forgotten. "And if I hadn't met you, I don't think I'd have remembered what it meant to live." He turned slightly, his hand finding hers inside her glove. "Then maybe that's why we found each other. Not to change the world, just to make one corner of it right again." The sky rippled with color above them, and for a moment the prairie looked like heaven made visible, vast, forgiving, infinite. When spring finally came, it came sudden and tender. The snow melted, rivers swelled, and the earth woke with wild joy. Flowers burst along the fence line, and the first foal was born in the pasture, a small, trembling creature Jing named Faith. Jackie laughed at the choice, but didn't argue. He said it fit. They worked together every day, their hands stained with soil, their clothes smelling of sun and wind. In the evenings they would sit on the porch, the sky spilling gold into violet. The world had finally grown quiet enough for love to speak without fear. Sometimes, when the wind moved just right, Jing thought she could hear the voices of all the women who had come before her, the ones who had crossed oceans, endured storms, kept walking when there was nowhere left to go. She carried them in her breath, in her laughter, in every act of care she gave. The ranch had become her sanctuary, her healing, her proof that even in the harshest land, gentleness could grow. And Jackie, he had changed too. His silence no longer carried sorrow, but peace. The loneliness that had once haunted his eyes had softened into something deeper, something sacred. He had learned to speak in small ways, a look, a touch, a smile that lasted a heartbeat longer than it needed to. Jing had taught him that words were not the only way to love. On a warm evening near the end of spring, they stood together at the edge of the fields, the wheat swaying in the wind. The sky stretched wide above them, full of promise. Jackie slipped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You see this land?" he said quietly. "It's different now." Jing looked up at him, her voice soft. "Because of the rain?" He shook his head. "Because of you." She leaned into him, the peace between them deep as the soil beneath their feet. Around them, the prairie whispered its eternal song of endurance, of renewal, of love that outlasts the storms. And though the world beyond their small corner still turned with noise and pride, within these wide fields there was only calm, the steady, healing rhythm of two souls who had found their way home. So if you ever wonder where the wind hums low and the horizon swallows the sun, listen closely. You might still hear their laughter carried across the grass, soft and enduring. A story of pain turned to gentleness, of two hearts that refused to give up on grace. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that love, even when quiet, can heal what life once broke, leave a comment, share your heart, and let others feel it too. Like the wind over these plains, your kindness carries farther than you know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, so more souls can find their way back to a little light, a little warmth, and a little faith that love, no matter how scarred, can always begin again.